Imagine standing on the edge of a frozen river on Christmas Eve, ready to end everything, when a complete stranger appears out of nowhere and somehow already knows exactly what you're about to do. Now imagine that same stranger turns out to be connected to a secret that's been hiding inside a hospital room the entire time. What if I told you this entire film is built around a twist so strange that critics genuinely could not agree on whether it was beautiful or just plain bizarre? Subscribe now, because today we are unpacking Noil, one of the strangest, saddest, and most divisive Christmas movies ever made. And trust me, you need to see how this one ends. The film takes place across a single night in New York City, Christmas Eve, when the streets are lit up with decorations and everyone around seems to be rushing home to family. Except for the handful of people this story actually follows, every single one of them isolated in their own particular kind of loneliness. The film opens with a woman named Rose Collins, a divorced book editor somewhere in her 40s, running into an old high school friend while out shopping. It's the kind of accidental run-in that should feel warm and nostalgic, but instead, Rose seems uncomfortable, almost evasive, telling a small lie about being married with a big happy family before quickly excusing herself. Why would someone lie about something like that to an old friend on Christmas Eve, of all nights? You get your answer almost immediately. Rose isn't heading home to a family at all. She's heading to a hospital, where her elderly mother, Helen, is a patient suffering from advanced Alzheimer's. Rose decorates her mother's room with small Christmas touches, even though Helen sits there vacantly, unable to recognize her own daughter or respond in any meaningful way. It's a quietly devastating scene, the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being unloved, but from loving someone who can no longer love you back in any way you can recognize. Across the hall, Rose notices another patient's room, this one completely bare, no decorations, no flowers, nothing personal at all. There's a man lying in the bed who appears to be in a coma, never moving, never responding. Something about the emptiness of that room moves Rose, and on impulse, she walks in and hangs a small angel figurine on the window, a quiet, almost involuntary act of kindness toward a total stranger who can't even thank her for it. When she turns around, she's startled to find she's not alone. A man named Charlie Boyd is sitting quietly by the doorway, having apparently been watching her the whole time. He's polite, a little awkward, clearly grateful for the small gesture she just made toward what turns out to be his relative in that bed. The exchange between them is brief, slightly stilted, the kind of accidental encounter between two strangers who probably won't think about each other again. Except, of course, this is exactly the kind of detail you should be paying attention to in a movie like this, because nothing here is quite as small or incidental as it looks. Meanwhile, across the city, a New York police officer named Mike Riley is dealing with problems of an entirely different nature. He's engaged to a strikingly beautiful woman named Nina, and on paper, they should be one of those Christmas Eve couples radiating happiness. But underneath the surface, their relationship is corroding from the inside, eaten away by Mike's jealousy. Every man who so much as glances at Nina becomes, in Mike's mind, a threat, and his possessiveness has gotten bad enough that Nina is seriously considering calling off the wedding entirely rather than spend the rest of her life feeling suffocated by his suspicion. What's it like to be loved by someone whose love comes wrapped in constant control? That's the question simmering underneath every scene between these two characters. Nina isn't naive about what she's dealing with. She loves Mike, but she's also exhausted by him, caught in that particular kind of relationship limbo where walking away feels just as painful as staying. Adding another layer of strangeness to Mike's night, he finds himself being followed and approached by a man named Artie, a lonely waiter who works at a local restaurant. Artie's behavior is bizarre from the start, fixated on Mike in a way that feels almost obsessive. As the night progresses, Artie reveals something deeply unsettling. He genuinely believes that Mike is the reincarnation of his own late wife. Pause on that for a second, because it's exactly as strange as it sounds. How is a hardened New York cop supposed to react to a stranger insisting, with complete sincerity, that he's the literal reincarnation of a dead woman? Mike's first instinct is to dismiss Artie as unstable, maybe even dangerous, but Artie's grief is so raw, so specific in its details about his late wife, that something about his sincerity becomes difficult to simply wave away as delusion. This subplot is, without question, the strangest thread running through the entire film, and it's exactly the kind of choice that splits audiences right down the middle. Some viewers find Artie's grief genuinely moving once it's fully explained. Others find the entire reincarnation angle so tonally bizarre that it pulls them right out of the emotional reality the rest of the film is trying to build. Which side do you land on? It's worth sitting with that question, because the film clearly wants you to take this thread seriously, and whether it earns that seriousness is honestly debatable. Back at her own apartment, Rose is dealing with her own quiet crisis of loneliness. A younger colleague at her office, a handsome man named Marco, asks her out, and after some hesitation, Rose actually says yes, allowing herself a small flicker of hope that maybe there's still room in her life for romance and connection, even while she spends most of her time consumed by caretaking duties for a mother who barely registers her presence anymore. The date doesn't go the way either of them planned. When Marco's interest in her becomes more overtly romantic back at her apartment, Rose finds herself unable to follow through, overwhelmed by a kind of emotional paralysis that's been building for who knows how long. Marco leaves, confused and a little hurt, and Rose is left alone again, the brief possibility of connection slipping away almost as quickly as it appeared. How much of Rose's inability to accept happiness in that moment comes from grief over her mother, and how much comes from years of putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own? The film doesn't spell it out neatly, but it's clearly building towards something, a breaking point that's been quietly accumulating throughout this entire lonely night. That breaking point arrives later, in one of the film's most striking and tonally heavy scenes. Rose ends up standing alone by the edge of a frozen river, staring down at the icy water with an expression that makes her intentions disturbingly clear. This isn't subtle imagery. This is a woman who has reached the absolute limit of what she can carry alone, contemplating something final on a night when the entire city around her is celebrating warmth and family and joy she doesn't have access to anymore. And then, almost as if summoned by the moment itself, Charlie Boyd appears. The same man from the hospital room earlier, the relative of the comatose patient Rose decorated a window for out of pure compassion. He talks her back from the edge, gently, persistently, somehow understanding exactly what's happening without needing it explained to him in detail. How does a man Rose has met only once before, briefly, in a hospital hallway, end up being the one person who finds her at the exact moment she needs someone most? That question becomes the central mystery driving the entire back half of the film, and the answer, when it finally arrives, is the reason this movie has such a strange, divisive reputation. As Rose and Charlie spend time together that night, talking, walking, slowly working through the weight of everything she's been carrying, something genuinely tender starts to develop between them, a connection built not on romance in any traditional sense, but on a kind of profound recognition, two people who understand loss and loneliness meeting each other exactly when it matters most. Meanwhile, Nina, having finally hit her own breaking point with Mike's jealousy, ends up crossing paths with Rose separately during the night. The two women, both worn down by the demands of men and circumstances beyond their control, share an unexpected, honest conversation about everything they're going through. It's a quiet, understated moment of solidarity between two strangers who recognize something of themselves in each other. There's also a smaller subplot running parallel to all of this involving a young man named Jules, who has a strange and specific Christmas tradition. He's trying to recreate the happiest Christmas memory of his life, which happened to involve being admitted to a hospital as a child. Apparently, he can't simply check himself involuntarily, so he goes to disturbing lengths to get hurt badly enough to be admitted, going as far as seeking out someone willing to deliberately break his hand just so he qualifies for emergency treatment on Christmas Eve. What does it say about a person's life when the happiest memory they have involves being injured and hospitalized? It's one of the stranger threads in a film already overflowing with strange threads, and it's also the one most critics single out as feeling disconnected from the emotional weight of everything else happening around it. Does it add meaningful texture to the film's larger meditation on loneliness, or does it feel like a tonal misstep dropped into an otherwise grounded story? That's exactly the kind of question this movie leaves you arguing with yourself about long after it ends. As Mike continues being pursued by Artie throughout the night, the waiter's story deepens. We learn more about his late wife, about the depth of his grief, about exactly why he's latched onto this stranger with such desperate, specific conviction. Whether or not you buy into the literal idea of reincarnation, the emotional core underneath it, a grieving man unable to let go, searching for any thread of connection back to someone he lost, is genuinely affecting once you separate it from its stranger framing. Eventually, Mike's night with Artie pushes him toward a kind of reckoning of his own. Confronted indirectly with the depth of loss Artie carries, And with how desperately his jealousy is pushing away the woman he loves, Mike starts to understand, slowly and painfully, just how much damage his possessiveness has actually caused. Will that understanding be enough to save his relationship with Nina before the night is over? That tension carries through to the film's final stretch. And then we arrive at the twist the entire film has been quietly building toward, the detail that recontextualizes everything between Rose and Charlie from the very first hospital scene. Remember the comatose patient in that bare hospital room, the one whose window Rose decorated with a small angel out of nothing but instinctive kindness? As the night progresses and Rose grows closer to Charlie, the truth slowly comes into focus. Charlie Boyd isn't simply visiting that patient as a concerned relative. Charlie himself is connected to that room in a way far stranger than ordinary family visitation. The film frames it almost like a quiet ghost story dressed up in Christmas lighting, suggesting that Charlie exists in some liminal space between life and death, tethered to that motionless body in the hospital bed, appearing to Rose specifically because of the small act of compassion she showed toward a room everyone else had given up on. Is he a spirit, an angel, some kind of metaphysical presence given temporary form specifically to guide Rose back from the edge of the river at the exact moment she needed saving? The film deliberately keeps this ambiguous rather than spelling it out in concrete terms. How do you feel about a film that spends most of its runtime grounded in believable, painful human loneliness, only to pivot in its final act towards something genuinely supernatural? That's precisely the line critics pointed to when they accused the film of becoming, in the words of one prominent review, so strange that it stopped being moving and just became plain weird. And honestly, it's hard to argue they're entirely wrong. The shift is jarring if you're not braced for it. But is jarring necessarily the same as bad? That's worth sitting with for a moment too. By the film's end, each thread resolves in its own particular way. Rose, having been pulled back from the brink by her strange encounter with Charlie, ends the night transformed, not in some explosive, dramatic way, but quietly, having found something resembling peace with her circumstances, with her mother's illness, with her own loneliness, in a way she clearly hadn't been able to access before this night began. Mike and Nina's relationship reaches its own resolution, shaped significantly by what Mike absorbs from his strange encounter with Artie throughout the night. Confronted so directly with what unchecked grief and possessiveness can do to a person who never learns to let go, Mike is pushed toward genuine reflection about his own behavior, about the jealousy that's been quietly poisoning the relationship he claims to value more than anything. And Jules, after going to such disturbing lengths to recreate his happiest memory, ends up discovering something different from what he expected to find, a reminder that chasing an exact replica of past happiness rarely produces the same feeling the second time around, and that sometimes the things we think we are nostalgic for were never really about the literal circumstances at all. So what do you actually do with a film like this once the credits roll? Here's my honest take on it. Noil is a movie that's far more ambitious than it has any right to be for a modest, mostly overlooked Christmas drama, and that ambition is both its greatest strength and its most obvious flaw. Susan Sarandon's storyline, the quiet devastation of loving a parent who's slipping away into Alzheimer's, paired with the crushing loneliness of putting your own needs last for so long that you forget how to reach for happiness even when it's offered to you, is genuinely one of the more emotionally honest depictions of caregiver burnout I've seen in a holiday film. That alone could have carried an entire movie on its own. The problem is that the film doesn't trust that story to be enough by itself. It keeps stacking additional threads on top of it. The jealous cop and his reincarnation-obsessed stalker, the man getting his hand broken on purpose to relive a childhood hospital stay, until the tonal whiplash between grounded grief and outright supernatural whimsy becomes genuinely difficult to reconcile. Some of these threads land emotionally. Others feel like they wandered in from a completely different movie and never quite figured out how to fit into this one. Is the final twist about Charlie beautiful or absurd? Honestly, I think it depends entirely on what you're looking for going into it. If you want your Christmas movies grounded and emotionally realistic all the way through, that final supernatural reveal is going to feel like a betrayal of everything the film built so carefully in its first hour. But if you're willing to meet a film on its own terms, to accept that a story about loneliness on Christmas Eve might reach for something a little stranger and more metaphysical to make its point about connection and compassion rewarding even the smallest acts of kindness, there's something genuinely touching buried underneath all that strangeness. What do you think, though? Does a film deserve credit for swinging big and ambitious even when it doesn't fully stick the landing? Or does an uneven, tonally scattered execution undercut whatever emotional goodwill it built up earlier? I'd lean towards saying this is a flawed film with a genuinely strong emotional core at its center, dragged down by subplots that needed either more development or considerably less screen time to feel like they belonged in the same story. If there's one thing this film gets right beyond any argument, it's the simple, quiet message threaded through everything else. A small act of unnoticed kindness, hanging an angel on a stranger's window for no reason other than instinct, can ripple outward in ways you never see coming, sometimes literally saving someone's life on the very night you least expect to matter to anyone. What's the loneliest you've ever felt during a holiday that's supposed to be about connection and warmth? And if a complete stranger showed up out of nowhere at your lowest moment, would you actually let them in, the way Rose eventually does, or would you push them away the way years of guarded self-reliance might train you to do instead? If this breakdown got you thinking, hit subscribe, because there are plenty more underrated and divisive Christmas films just like this one waiting to be unpacked, and I'd love to have you along for the next one.